All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. The Southeast Mental Health Technology Transfer Center would like to welcome you all to today's webinar event, Strengthening Career and Income Pathways for Individuals with Significant Psychiatric Disabilities, Education, Employment, and Disability Benefits. My name is Emily Moore, and I will be moderating today's event. I'm also joined by Southeast MHTTC Director, Dr. Ben Druss, who will be introducing our presenter today. A few words about our center before we get started. Please note that the work of our center is supported by a grant from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. And also please note that the larger MHTTC network and our center use affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all of our presentations and activities. The Southeast Mental Health Technology Transfer Center is proud to serve the 8 states in HHS Region 4. Our expertise in public health programs, systems, research, and evaluation provide a unique lens through which we can address mental health priorities. We encourage you to visit the Southeast MHTTC website, which is mhttcnetwork.org/southeast, to learn more about our center and our upcoming learning opportunities. A few important notes before today's event. This event is being recorded and will be posted to our website for on-demand viewing soon, typically in about 3 days. We encourage you to share your thoughts using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, and please remember to select chat with all attendees if you want to share your thoughts and comments with everyone. We have time reserved at the end of our presentation to answer any questions that you may have. Please submit your questions at that time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And finally, we do have a certificate of attendance available for our participants upon completion of our evaluation surveys. I'm now going to turn it over to Southeast MHTTC Director, Dr. Ben Druss, so that he can introduce today's presenter.
So it's my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Nev Jones. Dr. Jones is an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Pittsburgh. She is an international leader in research and practice development aimed at addressing poverty and improving quality of life among individuals experiencing significant psychiatric disabilities across the lifespan. Her work is motivated by direct personal and family experience of schizophrenia and intersecting public systems, subsidized housing, income, and disability-based welfare. She brings a deep commitment to transforming outcomes and, where necessary, fundamentally rethinking status quo approaches to psychiatric rehabilitation. She is currently primary investigator of a large NIMH grant focused on school, work, and disability benefit trajectories in the context of early psychosis. Nev, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you in advance. Really looking forward to this.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. And I am excited to be here, and I will go ahead and bring up my PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, well, I wish I could see everybody's faces. That's just, kind of the reality of virtual webinars, of course, but welcome to this. I will be focusing, as Ben mentioned, on strengthening career and income pathways for individuals with significant psychiatric disabilities, including these areas of education, employment, and thinking about disability benefits. Just a little bit more about me. Actually, a few things not on this slide. I have worn many, many different hats in this space, including working in service, mental health agency, and policy roles. For a while, I worked for the state of California as the acting consulting psychologist for the Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission. And that was a kind of a policy and implementation oversight and management role. So a lot of different hats, have founded and directed or co-directed a couple of different family, peer and family run organizations as well. Been responsible for performance reporting within agency settings, et cetera, et cetera. So I like to think of it as kind of bringing a very rounded perspective. More personally, so both kind of direct, I've been diagnosed with schizophrenia and family experience, close family member experience of schizophrenia, meaning that I literally kind of grew up with all of this since I was a young kid. And all the entanglements, right, with other public sector systems, income-based welfare, subsidized housing, SSI, and essentially my entire adult life, I've been a rep payee as well. And also kind of watching sort of both the opportunities that I've had and how that has, you know, kind of impacted my life, and other people who I am very close to who have kind of followed a very different kind of trajectory, largely because of kind of complex social and structural factors. And that's what motivates me to do the work that I do. And specifically, I think in the United States, right, so much of our identities and our standing in society do revolve around kind of finances, money, and work. So, you know, kind of work-related identities, but also how much of what it would otherwise mean to kind of engage in society becomes impossible when you're living, you know, kind of, for instance, far below the poverty limit. And I approach, for these reasons, I approach kind of psych rehab or community mental health services in a sense most fundamentally from an anti-poverty lens. I know intimately, and I'm sure, you know, most or all of you in the room have seen this, right? What it means for people to kind of live their lives in deep poverty and how that constrains what it's possible to do and be. And in my mind, that is the most fundamental thing that we need to address. Absolutely, in the United States, poverty intersects in profound ways with race through kind of structural racism, through policies that have enacted racialized poverty. So in no way want to imply that race is not a big piece of this, but you know, but at the end of the day, I think the reality we're confronted with here, and I'll say more about this, is the majority of people who end up kind of labeled or identified with serious mental illness are living in deep poverty. And that characterizes their lives. And that's where I think the change needs to happen. I think across multiple levels, which you will see reflected in this webinar. I don't think individual solutions are in any way going to kind of solve the problems that we really kind of confront as a country, and just in terms of mental health system or systems. At the same time, obviously, we can't ignore kind of individual level change. So, you know, really trying to kind of simultaneously think about change at multiple levels, and how people who are involved at different levels can still, you know, also at least kind of maintain a kind of a foothold at, say, higher or lower levels, right? So how do we prevent high-level policy folks or macro folks from becoming very disconnected from what's happening at the ground, but vice versa? How do we keep this huge kind of workforce, you know, on the ground, doing work every day in policy and exerting pressure on policy so that kind of things change? So that's kind of who I am. I also am I think I'm very aware of the significance of the impacts that psychiatric disabilities, including psychosis/schizophrenia, can have on people. I am not kind of unaware of the kind of reality of disability here. And simultaneously, I think a lot of the work I do engages with folks who are on SSI, SSDI, living in poverty, kept out in a way of more kind of career-oriented tracks for the wrong reasons because of social and structural determinants. So all of this is going to kind of infuse the presentation today. Just a brief funding acknowledgement. You know, a good portion of my salary nowadays is paid by the National Institute of Mental Health, and specifically in doing work on SSI work and school or education. So then just a few little kind of caveats and values beyond what I just mentioned. I don't shy away. Where I'm going to start in this presentation is by sort of naming what I see as these really kind of deep and entrenched social problems and inequalities that we're faced with as a field and as a society. But not in a hopefully, you know, kind of armchair academic, right, ivory tower kind of way. I'm constantly thinking about pragmatically how we bring about change in both what I, you know, often refer to as the short game and the long game. We need both. And again, just as like individual work, we can't lose sight of kind of higher level macro policy work. We can't lose sight of longer term goals because of shorter term goals that are more kind of immediately actualizable. I want to just read this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. And this is a really, really interesting speech. It was, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, just a few days ago. This is a lesser known speech. So most people know of Martin Luther King's comments on the Good Samaritan from other speeches. But this is a kind of critique, and it's actually a self-critique. He reflects on, if you read the entire speech, reflects on some of his earlier work and like, why was it one-sided? And this is titled The One-Sided Approach of the Good Samaritan. For those of you who don't know this story, the sort of the key characters are the Levite, the priest, and the Good Samaritan. And the Good Samaritan, you know, stops to help the individual in need, whereas the Levite and the priest pass by. So he's sort of, you know, critiquing this and saying, you know, not only might we think, well, maybe the Levite and the priest were actually going because they were, you know, like breezing on by because they were late for city planning meetings, right, to kind of address safety issues on the Jericho Road. But it's also easy to see the shortcomings in the conduct of the Samaritan. There is no suggestion that he sought to investigate the lack of police protection on the Jericho Road, nor did he appeal to any public officials to set out after the robbers and clean up. Here was the weakness of the Good Samaritan. He was concerned merely with temporary relief, not with thorough reconstruction. He sought to soothe the effects of evil without going back to uproot the causes. Now, without a doubt, social responsibility includes the sort of thing the Good Samaritan did. So we give to the United Appeals, the Red Cross, to all types of unfortunate conditions. In the midst of such staggering and appalling conditions, we cannot afford to simply pass by on the other side. Like the Good Samaritan, we must always stand ready to descend to the depth of human need. But there is another aspect of social responsibility which is just as compelling. It seeks to tear down unjust conditions and build anew instead of patching things up. It seeks to clear the Jericho Road of its robbers as well as caring for the victims of robbery. And then just an kind of acknowledgement and call out to, oh, this is a typo, but Howie the Harp, Howard Geld was his legal name. I'm sure many of you have heard the name. Really, really influential activist, you know, kind of beginning in the late 70s, you know, died very young of kind of what we would probably call physical comorbidities. Howie came, or Geld came, from an extremely disadvantaged background and did not graduate from high school. This is not an activist who was ever speaking from a place of privilege. And I think unsurprisingly, a lot of his work focused on housing, homelessness, or housing related issues, and then kind of employment. And he was equally inspired really by the independent living movement, is by what we would think of as sort of kind of peer service user survivor organizing. Wrote this in 1994. And he's kind of talking about consumer surveys that had happened kind of shortly before about other priorities, and then is turning to vocational rehab because he was asked to write a commentary on this. I expect consumer preference surveys regarding vocational rehabilitation will also confirm what consumers have been saying for years. Most consumers have rejected programs that place people in menial entry-level dead-end jobs while accepting programs that are geared to assist clients with training, counseling, and placement in jobs that can become careers. Quote, because of their psychiatric disability, many individuals post-secondary education has been discontinued and their career development disrupted. As a result, they feel resigned to a life of unemployment or a series of dead-end jobs in which they are disinterested and or for which they are overqualified. True then in 1994, true in, whatever he sort of really means by the decades that preceded that, right? On the ground work, hearing and talking to people being one of them, equally true now in 2023, right? Almost 30 years later. And I think that this kind of wisdom is really kind of fundamental of kind of what do people really want. Okay, so agenda, briefly, I'm going to go over kind of what are the problems we're up against. How bad is it? This won't take very long. Just a little bit on social welfare policy and why it matters here. Solutions that are already on the table, and I'm going to look kind of both within mental health and introduce you to some of the kind of employment and labor work technically happening outside of mental health in disability spaces or kind of low income kind of anti-poverty work. And then some more just kind of pragmatic thinking about how can we work together, not by necessarily following a particular practice or adopting a particular practice. How can we kind of transform the principles underlying and orientation underlying the work that I'm doing? So that's kind of where I'm going to go with this. Big picture problems in this country, I'm sure not news to any of you, right? We're dealing with structural racism and huge income inequality, a shrinking middle class, inflation, right, that's kind of out of control right now. And for the poor, right, what gets referred to in policy as the poor, a system of very restrictive kind of welfare benefits. So both on the kind of income-based side and the disability-driven side, we have what politicians love to refer to as a, quote, broken healthcare system, fragmented, decentralized, and stratified in terms of who you are and what type of insurance you have translates into quality, as we know, in paradoxical ways with the mental health system, because right, you can't access intensive services on the private side. So and then a significant discrimination in access to education and employment that begins in early childhood, right? So again, in a very kind of class-driven and racialized way, where you live, what your parents can afford, right? And then ways in which kind of later onset of things like a significant psych disability can even kind of take people who have started up here and enact a process of what sociologists call downward social mobility, right? Just because of discrimination, lack of opportunities, lack of supports. And then residential segregation, which of course we know happens for race and class related reasons, but also there's, a growing literature looking at how subsidized housing, including Section 8 vouchers, do not overcome problems of significant residential segregation. So people being essentially kind of trapped in what we often refer to as kind of service ghettos. Among those currently in the US, among those with schizophrenia spectrum diagnoses, estimates of long-term unemployment range from 70 to 90%. This issue of kind of neighborhood segregation that I was talking about, really high rates of food insecurity and inadequate access to healthy food, which for, any of you, and I'm sure many of you have worked in intensive public sector programs like, sort of community treatment teams, community support teams, et cetera. Right, it is impossible if you're assisting somebody to kind of plan out their shopping for the month with whatever they have left of their kind of SSI and maybe food stamps. You can't. I mean, probably any one of us in the room who has a more typical income, it's just a world apart from the constraints you're under kind of trying to manage and survive on, let's say, kind of an SSI income. Social welfare policy in the United States, the things I want to highlight is really the 1990s turn to kind of personal responsibility and a more minimalist social welfare system. And as much as we ding Reagan and the Reagan administration, this was Clinton, right? This was the New Democrats in the mid and late 90s. And so the Personal Responsibility Act, PRWARA, or popularly known as Workfare, passed in 1996, really limited access to income-based welfare. And researchers have argued really pushed people onto the disability rolls with all the restrictions that come along with SSI and SSDI enrollment and disincentives. And families often are pushed to kind of claim to enroll kids, right, minors in SSI, and in many cases that will then become the primary form of support for the family because of the inaccessibility of income-based welfare. A general emphasis on work, no matter the personal costs or lack of mobility involved, right? So this is sort of the trademark, in a sense, of workfare, right? We just gonna push people back into work as soon as, kind of humanly possible or as quickly as possible, limit benefits as much as possible, and generally into very, very low wage and or contingent kinds of positions. And as we'll see, there are parallels in the kind of psych rehab space, which I'll talk about. Disability and welfare linkages and disincentives, just as a reminder to all of us, I'm sure anybody kind of working with folks receiving SSI, knows most of this, but there are, kind of gatekeeper functions for SSI, SSDI. You get on that Section 8 voucher list that is now 20 years long, which is true in some parts of the country, right? You get prioritized if you're on SSI. So sometimes it's more or less direct. Medicaid and non-expansion states, a whole bevy of residential services, waiver programs under Medicaid, right? So there's a lot of things that become linked, and you will lose all of that. It's not just that you're losing your SSI income if you exit the program. And meanwhile, there is little to no assistance built into the way we currently approach kind of disability-based welfare in the US around education and training. Let's support people while we're getting them back to school and find ways to actually finance or subsidize education, specifically targeting or focused on individuals with disabilities, right, who face often kind of staggering kind of financial costs otherwise. And again, and I'll talk more about this later, but just this emphasis on kind of quantity versus quality, getting people into positions, no matter what they are, kind of low wage, minimum wage, or even below minimum wage in sort of net terms, rather than an orientation to what does it take to move people out of poverty. Right? That's the end game. That's the goal. What does it take to get them there? Not just these kind of hyper immediate kind of focus. workforce policy, I want to say really matters to you. And I'm assuming that, kind of all of you are like working in this space, right? Systematic underfunding and underinvestment, again, both directly and indirectly in the public sector workforce. This plays out in terms of wages, benefits, and for a lot of folks and roles, really limited career mobility. For folks who don't have some form of master's level licensure or above, right? A lot of kind of limits in terms of mobility. Peer specialists, it's particularly an issue, but equally so, I would argue, supported employment, supported housing workers. So a lot of the positions that are actually most directly engaged with social and structural determinants get the least compensation and have the most kind of problematic lack of mobility in terms of advancement and higher pay. Medicaid reimbursement rates, we know, are a huge problem. The sort of overall ethos of the managed care emphasis on cost cutting and cost savings, and that starts to kind of dictate and shape a lot about the system, but very much the experience of providers in the system. And then top-down programmatic requirements that don't actually account for local provider or service user needs. Some of this can play out in terms of evidence-based practices. You must implement an evidence-based practice. Actually, it turns out there's not really even one that's really appropriate, but you have to pick off the list and then you just have to do it. So that kind of decontextualized top-down decision-making and absolutely impacts people on the ground. Have had so many conversations with providers doing direct service work, right, about the sort of the resentment and short-sightedness of what's being imposed on them and that limits their ability to work in a more person-centered way. And then providers often end up working from a place of what I would kind of think of as short-term survival. I've been there, like I get it, right? So for and on behalf of their organizations or agencies, you have to meet contract deliverables, you have to meet performance requirements, you have to stay out of the red. At more executive levels in agencies, right? Like that was like every meeting I used to be in when I was in this kind of role. And then for and on behalf of clients, it's that same sort of short-term survival becomes kind of dominant. And it's very important to think about short-term survival, but again, this kind of counterbalancing that I keep bringing up. Okay. Now I'm going to dive in, and please be putting any like kind of questions, thoughts, comments into either the chat or the Q&A as we're going. But the sort of the dominant models, I'm sure most of you know, that's out there is individual placement and support kind of style of supported employment, sometimes just referred to as evidence-based supported employment, which is de facto IPS model. I do want to acknowledge really good place that IPS originally came from in terms of reacting to a landscape in the 80s and early 90s of a lot of kind of sheltered workshops and wanting to kind of move away from that. So there's an emphasis on kind of no barriers, rapid placement, right? Often referred to as place then train rather than train then place. It includes an emphasis on job development, so demand side or employer side relationship building, which is important, but the devil is in the details, I think, of both how it's approached and what is in fact kind of shaping that socially, structurally, and contextually. So, this is just kind of some brief comments, right? But what we know from actually SSA funded demonstration projects is that provision of supported employment, evidence-based IPS supported employment actually fails to support individuals to exit SSI or SSDI, or in that sense, kind of move out of poverty. Job tenure is certainly longer and not net pay higher, but we're kind of talking cents. Right? We are not talking that this is the difference between people moving into living wage, especially like in an expensive city, right? Moving into living wage jobs and gaining financial independence. No, it's like sort of kind of cents on the dollar more. And even the kind of length of job tenure is like weeks. So kind of really thinking about what that means in a deeper way is really different from kind of statistical significance, right? And it translates into a majority of short-term, low-wage and contingent positions for people that don't move them out of poverty. Job development, not necessarily intentionally, not saying this is some like kind of nefarious master plan behind IPS, but job development overwhelmingly tends to involve local low-wage employers. And I think the reality is often those employers are receptive to these kinds of programs because these are actually jobs that are often like hard to fill or not particularly desirable and don't come with kind of inbuilt opportunities for mobility and advancement in more significant ways. So big picture comments, right? This is fine as one tool in our toolbox when it comes to kind of dominate the landscape and monopolize things. That's where I really have a concern because clearly we need more than this, right? If our goal is really this kind of anti-poverty mission. Supported education is an interesting case of an intervention that, with a few exceptions, like Fountain House College reentry in New York City and Boston University's NITEO, which is not really a public sector model at all, college reentry more is, in Kamenar and San Mateo, California, we have seen very little happening in terms of mechanisms to fund and support really like high quality supported education programs. We have seen research just fall off the wayside. So very little is happening in this space. The 1990s were really the heyday of supported education research, and it's very sad and sometimes just gets kind of folded into supported employment models. But if you look at kind of the real core models, they're providing like intensive wraparound services, typically by a multidisciplinary team, to really get folks with significant barriers, often both financial and disability related, back into school and to really be successful there and graduate. So we really just kind of don't have a lot happening in this space. It's therefore, in spite of being actually an older model in some sense, is an emerging model because we don't have strong evidence behind it because the research hasn't been funded. Self-directed care, I think, is worth bringing up in this case. So for those of you who aren't familiar with self-directed care, having come from Florida before I moved to Pennsylvania, Florida actually has great self-directed care models, not as widespread as they should be, but they exist. I'm not sure about other Southeast states. But it's really kind of an alternative to traditional Medicaid service delivery and management that allows individuals and supports individuals to exercise much more autonomy and really kind of decision-making authority about how their Medicaid funds are used and who's providing the services. Medicaid uses two terms, employer authority and budget authority, and not all state level SDC programs have both. But employer authority gives the individual, the service user, right, the authority to recruit, hire, train, and supervise the individuals who are furnishing their services. And budget authority is decision-making authority over how the Medicaid funds are spent. What we see, and again, there are variations in different implementations and models, is that you can actually kind of use the funds in many cases to actually more fundamentally address social and structural determinants. So an example, you can't drive to a job because you don't have a car. In some SDC implementations, you're actually going to be able to use those funds to buy a used car, pay for repairs to a car you might have access to, but that doesn't run. If you need more classes, so let's say you experience psychosis for the first time while in community college trying to complete an AA or a nursing certificate or something, you just need a few more classes. You can actually, in many state implementations, use those SDC funds flexibly to pay for that. So I think there's a lot, we haven't talked as much in policy terms about self-directed care and its links to employment and financial independence, but there's a lot of potential here. So again, I'm just kind of breezing through things because if you get interested and don't already know about it, I would love to have more conversations, but we as a field should be having more kind of conversations and thinking more creatively about some of this stuff. The Americans with Disabilities Act. So I think sometimes there's kind of a popular misconception that the ADA solved a lot of our problems and that therefore, in a sense, we should be focusing more on the individual because ADA policies really require and mandate accommodations in both work and employment, and educational settings. And really, that's not true. If you look at the legal literature on the ADA, it is widely considered to have failed in terms of meeting the needs and ensuring rights and protections of people, particularly with mental disabilities. Mental disabilities playing out right more in this space. So a huge literature looking at both how judicial decisions have systematically eroded protections that were meant to be there, that if you read the language of the ADA, that was certainly the intent, but it is not what ends up actualized because of very conservative judicial precedent that's now quite entrenched. Legal scholars have pointed to, in fact, a huge lack of public support for any deeper form of cultural and organizational change. So the ADA's legislation got through remarkably easily, but nobody really bought into it. So that's kind of the irony. So where you would really have to see, organizational transformation in the sense of we actually want people with disabilities here and at all levels and want to create an environment that makes that possible. That is absolutely not what has happened. And with the erosion of judicial precedent, organizations, higher ed institutions, universities, it's what's common to see is absolutely sort of minimal compliance with the law. And that is not enough. That is not enough when we're talking about significant psychiatric disabilities. And then kind of stigma and prejudice that is ongoing and really kind of fuels this disinterest, in a sense, in going above and beyond this kind of minimalist compliance mentality. And we really need to change that. Really important work from folks like Bernice Pesco-Solido, who does population level kind of stigma assessment, getting worse for people with schizophrenia, dramatically worse in the last decade and the decade before that. So we are not, if we think that we're kind of, as a culture and as a society, improving our attitudes towards people with SMI, we actually are not. We're actually going in the opposite direction. And we really need to like rally together and push back against this. And I think part of it is depression attitudes are getting better, mild to moderate anxiety getting much better, but this does not hold for schizophrenia. And I really think the majority of people who have been kind of categorized as experiencing SMI and are in kind of these kinds of intensive public sector services. Now turning a little bit, and this is not meant to be kind of exhaustive, limited amount of time, right? If we start to look outside the public mental health system, I want to first call attention to the career edge model. This is when I was living and working in Florida. This is really kind of how I found out about the career edge model and the work that they're doing. And I believe it's now actually expanding in the Southeast region outside of Florida. On the next slide, I have the URL if you want to look them up. They have been explicitly now in Florida anyway, adapting these programs for folks with disabilities, including very specifically psych disabilities. So quite in contrast to what we think of as kind of mental health side, evidence-based supported employment, the entire orientation of Career Edge is how do we get people to a living wage and how do we get them to a place where they are in a track with career mobility. And all the metrics, if you look at their reports, are about that. It's not, did we get somebody a job, any job at all, no matter how terrible it is, totally not about that. They are measuring themselves based on, are they moving people out of poverty into career mobility and getting them at a bare minimum, a true living wage for the area that they're living in. the sort of basic steps of their model, and they have diversified in a variety of ways with paid internship programs and other interesting stuff you can find on their website. But the basic steps are to identify local employers in growth sectors with living wage benefited jobs with opportunities for career mobility. So it's not who would be willing to hire people with disabilities. It's instead, where are there jobs largely in the tech sector and in healthcare, right? Where there is the possibility to really, really move out of poverty, right? And then they broker a relationship, get a commitment, and tax incentives help with this, to hire cohorts of individuals who are currently living in poverty, most often following the completion of training, community college, or certificate programs. And I think most of what I've seen in Florida, again, has been nursing, health, IT, med tech kind of stuff. And other just kind of tech sector roles. A lot of the time, you don't actually need a full degree. In general, this is kind of true. You don't need a full-fledged college degree, but you need kind of specialized training. And so in a sense, they are very much a train and place, but a contemporary version of train and place that is certainly not about sheltered workshops, right? Their evaluation, as I mentioned, attaining a living wage, career mobility over time. They track, are people getting promoted? So promotion is a major metric. Pay increases. So again, it's, evidence-based practice is always risks kind of oversimplifying what we're talking about. There's evidence about A, there's evidence about B, there's evidence about C, and they are very different things. So the evidence here and the orientation is towards these metrics of the level of wage, right, and career progression. And that starts to change and shift like what's happening, right, and how quality improvement can occur. So again, really encourage you to check out kind of Career Edge. This is their website, careeredgefunders.org, and just kind of think about that. And when I was doing mental health provider TA in Florida, I was like constantly kind of telling counties and stuff who didn't already have Career Edge programs to look at it, if not working directly with them, thinking about it as a model, as an alternative model. People might be more familiar with different variations on microfinancing schemes, collaborative loan programs, and other ways of incentivizing and supporting small business development. One big issue with folks with psych disabilities is that relatively fewer people are kind of experiencing the same thing and the same barriers and challenges 24/7, right? People have episodes, things ebb and flow, are up and down, and those periods can be shorter or longer, right? And so one of the kind of really promising things about small businesses, LLCs, is that people have the flexibility to work more when they're able to, and work less or not at all when they're not. So there's kind of an inherent flexibility in small businesses, right, and kind of self-entrepreneurship that are really important to be thinking about. And actually, there are great programs and models. I just have a couple of examples here with the links. The Minnesota Emerging Entrepreneur Loan Program, which, among other groups, kind of disadvantaged groups, targets eligible individuals with disabilities. New York Entrepreneurs with Disabilities is another flavor of this kind of program. And nothing in them rules out people with psych disabilities. They're just not as maybe specifically adapted. They could be, they should be, and we should embrace the opportunities that these existing programs create for folks we might be working with experiencing significant psych disabilities. And there's others, so the VLSA model, which has been implemented more in low and middle income settings, is kind of premised on locally self-managed and self-capitalized savings groups. And there are parallels into of this in the US, just not that I have seen focused on folks with disabilities, although that's very much the case in Africa. So again, there are there's this landscape of other ways that are concrete, real, have already been developed and implemented, would be my big picture message here, to help people move out of poverty, and that orient to the different ups and downs and ebbs of flows of psych disabilities, which are, often much more kind of variable in that way than, let's say a spinal cord injury that is what it is. And so it's sort of, you're dealing with something that's relatively fixed and consistent what the challenge is, but psych disabilities can be up and down, which also creates opportunities for people to do a lot during periods when they feel up to it. Okay, and then next, I want to just move into, and we're moving towards the end of the webinar, so we have time for Q&A, but just a few more slides. I want to just briefly talk about just some changes in our underlying orientation and thinking, regardless of what practices or models we might be implementing. And so kind of first at the micro and kind of meso level, individual and interpersonal, and thinking about clinical work, refocusing on career development and mobility. And this is maybe especially true in youth and young adult serving programs. I don't think we should stop thinking about career development at any point in the lifespan, but it seems particularly pressing to not to really kind of talk and think about career development earlier on in people's lives. So really kind of building in resources and supports for longer term career planning and development, of which there are so many, so much work across multiple fields, including, kind of education, as well as, again, more kind of cross disability and kind of low income, at-risk youth kind of areas. How does one support a young person, including from very kind of disadvantaged backgrounds, right, to really start building towards a longer term career? And not just, let's get you a job in the Amazon warehouse, let's get you a job as a gas station attendant, but how do we work with and support people to really kind of start thinking about long-term careers, and then the kinds of activities that you would be involved in. When SSI and SSDI are first being considered, right, that there is really balanced, supported decision-making, including approached with an understanding. We all get that often money is just urgently needed, but it is also a reality that this is a long-term poverty trap for most people who end up on SSI, because then they end up increasingly dependent on the multiple systems that wrap around SSI, and it just becomes impossible to extract yourself from that. And so families understanding that, I talk to a lot of families who have no understanding that there are any risks at all, right? There's no discussion about that. They've not been kind of supported or engaged in really kind of thinking about that. And is there any alternative off-ramp, right? Before we do that, could we get this young person back into community college? Could we work with them around some kind of career track that will actually get them ultimately to a much higher wage and level of financial independence than if they end up on SSI? Provider advocacy. So another thing, and again, I do a lot of work in this area, interviewing providers, supported employment providers, families, individuals, especially young adults with first episode psychosis, but also more broadly. Provider advocacy, again and again, I interview folks who are working in the supported employment and education space who really don't understand the limitations of the ADA or what it means to actually advocate for more robust supports, not just the checkbox list that you will often get either from an HR department in the case of employment or from a university, and really seeing that as part of the role. Systems change advocacy, not just kind of deference to existing mechanisms and policies, or reliance on goodwill, right? Like, well, if I, kind of am friends with somebody in this office. No, like sometimes we really need to raise the bar on the environments we're sending people into. Financial empowerment, again, I think we see more growth in this space. Some of my friends are doing kind of awesome intervention development work around financial empowerment, but really kind of going beyond traditional benefits counseling to think about and dive into skills, strategies, and frankly, workarounds to survive with very limited means. And one other I'll say here is building awareness of, not that it is an unproblematic landscape, but of ways in which you can potentially kind of finance higher education. In a huge national project that I did surveying peer specialists across the US, it was overwhelming. Over 90% of them said that if they possibly could, they would want to go to school. In most cases, that would be, undergraduate, very, very few people who already had a BA or anything like that, right? Overwhelmingly want to go. Biggest barrier, finances and financing, like seeing no pathway to getting back into higher ed. So like empowering people to think about that and know the options, which are not great in this country, but they are there. There are programs, and like finding them and knowing them locally is really important. I have done a ton of work on really kind of thinking about and operationalizing what it would really mean to support students with psychosis, in this case, in the context of higher education, both in terms of like what families and students need to know around including much more robust asks that one can make in the ballpark of accommodations than most people know. And also speaking to campus administrators, staff, and faculty about what can you change if you actually want to support folks with significant psych disabilities. A lot of transformative work that can happen. And I do trainings on these. If anybody is interested, very happy to say more. I'm just kind of flying through it. But this is the kind of stuff that we can be bringing into our programs, making sure people know and are aware of, and therefore are able to support clients or kind of service recipients, right, in a more kind of empowering way. Macro, really quickly, if you don't already know, this huge amount of work that was done when Biden first assumed the presidency, right, and in kind of early legislation around Build Back Better, did not get included in like the 12th hour, 11th hour. And that was largely, or at least in part, right, because this is not a powerful coalition or special interest relative to other folks who were trying to get like, right, their quote special interests in. These are very reasonable. American Progress Foundation, in collaboration with numerous disability entities nationally, around modest, but still really important increases to the maximum SSI benefit, increasing SSI asset limit, so the amount that you can save or accrue in assets, which is currently capped at $2,000, and updating SSI disregard thresholds. In the interest of time, I'm just kind of flying through this, but we need to be a part of this. Mental health providers, associations really need to be much more a part of, we have got to change and update SSI policy. And our clients need to know and be more empowered, right? I think people have internalized a lot of like, this is just the way it is and nothing's ever going to change. Addressing discrimination, right, in schools and places of employment, supporting and strengthening ADA requirements and enforcement, and then lastly, kind of building an evidence base behind interventions that, again, as I know I just keep repeating it and hammering on it, but to say it one last time, that are really ameliorating poverty. We need an evidence base. We do. I'm a researcher, right? But we need an evidence base about how do we actually get traction over poverty in this population, in this community, and we don't have it. And then Supported education and employment workforce. So just, this is my last slide, but just to really emphasize, right, that employment support providers, which get labeled different things in different states and different programs, are often themselves earning barely above minimum wage. In some cases, maybe not quite as low in the kind of provider hierarchy as peer specialists, but very close. There's really limited kind of career mobility and career pathways unless you become like a licensed social worker or counselor, right? And really limited initial training and continuing education opportunities in the US that are, for instance, really robustly building skills around the ADA, what's really wrong with the ADA, how you can try to address some of what's wrong with the ADA, how you can really engage in legal advocacy, what career development, all this sort of world of career development resources. So I think that we really underestimate in this particular workforce to the detriment of us all, really. And I've spent some time in Australia, specifically kind of touring and engaging with Australian employment and education support programs. And this was the biggest difference, is that people are really paid well and trained well in these roles, right? And it's really considered an important high value skill set that you really kind of develop. And talking to folks engaged in kind of, you know, what we would otherwise call supported employment work, who really have been trained to work with employers across the sort of wage and class spectrum, right? So they're really working to kind of develop high-level white-collar jobs and opportunities as much as they are kind of entry-level low-wage jobs. So, you know, that can look really different, but we have to compensate people adequately. We have to provide them with training and then take seriously at a systems level and policy level that these skills really matter. Okay, that was the last slide. Now open for any questions that you guys might have. Put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A. Okay, so Holly, just in the Q&A, I'll start with this one. How can we advocate for changes to SSI policy? What does that look like from a case manager or client advocate level? So big question, right? So I think part of it where I would start is there's a lot of like kind of internalization of inequality that happens at every level, but very much happens to people who are receiving SSI and services. And politically, we end up, you know, with a huge problem when the population most impacted has so kind of internalized policy inequality that they're not pushing for change. And I absolutely think that on many levels, this describes kind of folks with SMI in this country, just such disempowerment and exclusion that's so pervasive. And a lot of, we see like kind of peer movement leaders who are from very high SES backgrounds and have never dealt with this poverty. So like, it's not even just that, oh, that there's no kind of peer movement, it's that the interests of folks living in significant poverty are not necessarily reflected even in the peer sector. And Howie the Heart, by the way, made this point repeatedly when he was still active, like really kind of accusing leaders of having kind of disregarded, specifically, he calls out SSI reform. So part of it is that we need people to be aware and empowered. And so like really kind of speaking and having these conversations with clients. Not that that means we can magically change it, but that kind of political conscientization actually is essential and also guards against internalization of, you know, I'm worthless, I don't matter to society, reframing that as this is actually social injustice I'm up against, and I can be part of fighting this, not just for myself, but for my community, for people who will come after me. And then I think, in every state, professional associations are, among the most kind of powerful lobbyists, right? When I worked for the state of California, I would, kind of jokingly say that certain professional associations camped outside my door. But, so providers who are active in kind of pushing and shaping the agendas of those professional associations, that of course plays out nationally with the national equivalent and at the state level. And then, I think keeping the conversations alive is essential. It's essential because if, for example, the Southeast MHTTC weren't doing a webinar like this, what starts to happen when cumulatively these conversations aren't happening and we're not talking about them? So just that alone, although it may not seem like it's changing anything, it is kind of keeping these questions alive and keeping the conversation alive. And that alone, really, we should not underestimate the power and importance of that. So that's sort of a beginning conversation. I actually teach policy to MSW students, so I do a lot of thinking about how can kind of everyday providers be involved, and would be happy to talk about that more. And I think we are out of time. I just want to mention, thank you to people who just posted. I think this webinar will be posted. Certificates and follow-ups will go out to everyone, et cetera. But just want to thank you all for being here. My email line, so to speak, is open, and my email address is on the first page of the PowerPoint, which will be posted. And I would welcome further conversations with folks.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for such an informative presentation. That's going to conclude our presentation and webinar for today. If everyone would please fill out the SAMHSA required survey at the link or QR code on your screen. And I also think that Stephanie is going to drop it in the chat for your convenience. That will be it for today. Dr. Jones, thank you so much again for joining us.